Hello and welcome to the NevilleResearch.com video. In the last episode, we went over William Shakespeare's handwriting and sort of determined whether he could write his name or not. And my conclusion from that was that he could write his first name reasonably well, but didn't really know how to write his last name. Now, here are the signatures here on the left. So here is the one from 1612. You know, he abbreviated the first name and wrote the last name, only wrote the first two letters correctly, and the rest. So this is an S and this is an H, and the rest of these are not. The rest of this really is not even letters. This one he wrote W, I guess an M up here, and the K isn't really well formed. The P is okay, S and H, and the H is different from the one up here. This one's probably his best one. He blotches the W. He writes William pretty well here. The H is different again from this one. The A is okay. The K isn't well formed. The P and the E seem okay. He doesn't finish it. He's a little space constrained. This one is really badly written. This one is really badly written, but the William is okay. These two are from the will, so he might have had some disability. The K is not well formed here, and the rest of the letters are very poorly formed. So, in summary, he doesn't really know how to write his last name, apparently, and he doesn't do it consistently, but he sure does seem to know how to write his first name or practice before these. Sort of not clear if he knew how to write at this point, but maybe did some practice and was able to learn how to write his first name. So, it's one thing to just criticize somebody's handwriting, but the question is, well, what about everybody else at that time? Were other people able to write their names? And what was the style of signature at that time? So I went on State Papers Online, and I've collected some signatures from the same period, from like 1612 to 1615, people by the name William. And let's just take a look at them and see how they look. Okay? So here's somebody who writes up the full name William in italic handwriting. Very simply, nothing too fancy, but this shows you how people could write their names. And here, somebody looks like they wrote a W and wrote IAM on top, and then their last name. So sort of stylized. Now, some of the apologists for Shakespeare say, oh, well, he didn't write in italic handwriting. He didn't have a special italic signature, but he wrote it in secretary hand, and that's just normal. Well, this guy's doing the same thing. Here's a W, here's an M, and there's his last name, and it's written in nice secretary hand. And, of course, that's a perfectly normal thing to do. Probably it was less common than writing it out in italic in sort of a set way, but plenty of people did sign their names that way. But they usually did it the same way. Now, like this guy here is abbreviating a WM, and maybe sometimes he wrote out his name, William, maybe he wrote Will sometimes, I don't know, but people were consistent in how they signed their names. They might vary it or abbreviate it sometimes, but it was a consistent, and sometimes people did change the spelling slightly, but it was generally consistent in the way they signed their names. They had a set way of signing their name, just like they do today, and partly because they want people to be confident that they wrote the letter. And that was especially important because a lot of people had other people write their letters for them. They would have a secretary or a scribe write out the letter, and they would just sign it. So by having a set signature, it would create more confidence that they actually had written it. So this is an example of good secretary handwriting by somebody who has, decent handwriting, signing their name. Now, the squiggle down here, it could be that somebody signed it for him. It could be an indication that a scribe signed it for him. We'd have to research that. But this is an example of secretary handwriting, good secretary handwriting, clearly written. Here's an example of an abbreviation. So he writes WILLM, and this line here is the abbreviation mark. This is very common for people to write William, WILLM with the line, and usually the line would go through the double L's. And Shakespeare sort of tries to do the same thing here, but doesn't really know, maybe doesn't know how to do it correctly, or it doesn't really follow through on that. So these two things are not letters. They're not well-formed letters. The W, I, and the L are correct, and then he has this abbreviation mark here. So this is how you would do it if you knew how to write. How to write. This one, it doesn't even look like William to me, but state paper says it is. So this is sort of a fancy stylized abbreviation. Here's another guy who writes WM in italic, and then his last name. It's a simply written signature. It's just the letters. It's just written out. You don't have to. The issue isn't that Shakespeare doesn't have a stylized signature and that he doesn't have crazy flourishes or whatever. The issue is that he doesn't have a consistent signature. They're not consistent. The letters are not formed well. But, if you read, if you read Shakespeare's plays, letter writing is a huge plot point in lots of these plays. People are forging letters, and they're losing letters, and they're, reading letters out loud, and there's all kinds of letters going on in these plays. So anyone who was writing at that time 36 plays and 3 books of poetry would be a regular letter writer, somebody who writes a lot of letters. And anybody like that would have a set way of writing their signature. Even if they varied their signature, abbreviating it sometimes, or even changing the spelling slightly, they would have a set way of doing it. And William Shakespeare, we can look at this again. There's nothing consistent here. He's all over the place compared to these stylized signatures. Now, here's a nice William down here. He's sort of got a fancy W with this weird loop, and he sort of maybe individualized it that way, but it's written very simple way. Once again, we have abbreviation. So he has the colon here, W-I, and he puts the, maybe that's an L, I don't know, and he puts a line through it. So there's another example of somebody abbreviating it. There's nothing wrong. It's perfectly typical. Here he's abbreviating W-I-L-L with a colon. But the letters are well formed. The style is normal. It's typical of that period. This is a simply written William. Once again, this is secretary hand. It's written out simply. The last name is even a little messy, I guess. But clearly this person knows how to write their name. This is a nice one. So he's got that W, and he's just not even writing out his name. But then he has this, brings it right into the next letter. Very nice way of writing your name. Here's another guy. He has W, M on top. And then he writes out his full last name. This is very simple secretary hand. There's nothing special about this at all. He writes out William, and then he writes out his last name. This is a properly formed K. All the letters are properly formed, easy to read. That's what signatures usually were like. Either they were very fancy or they were simply written out. Here's another William with a sort of a fancy W. Sort of made the W fancy, this S is sort of fancy. So he's making it fancy for his signature. That's nice. And here's another abbreviation with the colons. So, as you can see, these are not cherry-picked examples. I went through the state papers. I just put these together, people from the period, people who first name was William. And it's just a completely different situation. Now, you might say, oh, these people are high-class people. These are very well-educated or whatever. But if Shakespeare wrote 36 plays and 3 books of poetry, by the end of his career, he should be able to sign his name in a reasonable way like everybody else. Okay? He could have done it in a unique way, in an unusual way, but that's not what we have in these examples here, okay? What we have in these examples here are somebody who just doesn't know what they're doing. They're just sort of trying different stuff out or doing their best to write out their name. It's nothing sophisticated, as opposed to the actual works of Shakespeare, which are so literate and so sophisticated and so involved with language and letter writing and wordplay and all these things. So it's just ridiculous, the suggestion that William Shakespeare wrote 36 plays, 3 books of poetry, and can't even sign his name on legal documents. So I hope you'll look at this carefully again, take your time and look at these examples, and think about it. So thank you for stopping by. You can click like and you can subscribe to this channel, and please tell your friends.